So we're here at 10 o'clock. It's great to have folks here for joining in the conversation about equitable broadband access in Kansas. Ed O'Malley, it's all yours.
Thank you, Thane. It's good to be with everyone. Great to have you. Thank you for being a part of this conversation. We are so excited to talk about this. I'll tell you, the main thing we're excited about is the response we received from people all around the state and beyond who want to be in this conversation. I want to give a big thank you to the Topeka Chamber of Commerce. You'll hear from Michelle Stubblefield in just a moment. They are our partner in crime with this. This idea came from them. We're happy to have been a help to make this happen. Great to have you all with us today. Let me tell you a little bit about our objective, and then I also want to tell you just a bit about how the hour will flow. Our objective is for this to be a conversation catalyst. Our objective is for this hour, it's only an hour, it's not much time, this hour to catalyze our thinking and our conversations after this hour. Almost everybody, as I was looking through the roster of people who registered, almost everybody is fairly well connected in their communities, in systems and organizations and communities across our great state. And we know this issue, the issue of broadband access and infrastructure, is critical to our future. So our hope is, in a little way, this 1 hour discussion propels conversation. We know there's a lot of conversation already happening on this subject. We think that's fantastic. And this is one of those issues where more, we believe, is better. For those of you not familiar with the Kansas Leadership Center, we're based in Wichita. We do work across the state of Kansas. Our main funder, our main investor is the Kansas Health Foundation, who understands that our health, broadly speaking, is determined by our economic opportunity, our education opportunity, our access to resources and opportunity. And certainly today, something like broadband access is one of those critical needs. The way the day will flow is after a few more remarks from me, I'm going to introduce Michelle from the Topeka Chamber. We'll have a conversation with Stanley Adams, who's the Kansas Broadband Director. He'll provide us some base knowledge of what's happening on this topic. And then we're going to do something I'm super excited about. We're going to talk with Deb Miller, former Secretary of Transportation for the state of Kansas. And we're going to use the transportation plans in the past as a metaphor for talking about how a state builds out an infrastructure. And I'm excited about that metaphor. So I'm going to ask you to open your mind and imagine a conversation about roads and highways as a conversation about broadband infrastructure and technology access. I think it's going to be a neat way to think about it. We're going to get into some conversation after that. We'll have you in some small groups with just a big open-ended question, and then we'll come back to the large group. We'll end promptly at 11. Again, the goal is to catalyze our thinking, catalyze our conversation, get us thinking more, perhaps thinking differently, and engaging with others more, and perhaps engaging with others differently on this subject as we move into the future. I'm really excited to introduce Michelle Stubblefield, our good friend from the Topeka Chamber of Commerce. She directs the Greater Topeka Leadership Program. She's been a longtime partner and champion of the Kansas Leadership Center. Many of you know that KLC works to build the capacity of literally thousands of Kansans every year. Michelle got involved with us from the beginning. And Michelle, I think we have learned as much from you as I hope you have learned from us. Michelle's very involved in her community. She's the chair of the Community Recovery Task Force for Topeka and Shawnee County. And super excited that she had the idea to bring this conversation, not just to her community, but across the state. So Michelle, let me hand it over to you for some introductory remarks, and then I know you'll get the conversation started with our friend Stanley Adams. Michelle, go for it.
Thank you so much. And again, Ed, I appreciate from Kansas Leadership Center's willingness to participate in this. It has been a really fun to not only have this conversation locally, but now to bring that to the forefront across the state. Why are we having this discussion? Well, serving as chair of the Recovery Task Force, we had a number of focus areas. And those focus areas were anything from education to healthcare to government, to economic recovery, and across the board, without any prompting, and from an organic conversation with the task groups, everybody in the recommendations, and that was part of the requirement of the task force, is to develop some recommendations. They all came back with broadband and digital equity as an important component to moving the community forward with the recovery. It's always been an issue. I think in many of your communities, you've talked about it from time to time. What can we do? And then sometimes it's an ebb and flow and it kind of stalls. Well, I think with COVID, it really brought about that urgency. So we began discussing locally about how we do that. But it came pretty apparent that we can't just have this conversation locally. It's going to take a state effort to do that. And with the spark dollars and everything coming to play, it obviously made it even more, resonated even further about the importance of having this discussion. So in visiting with the Kansas Leadership Center, I truly do see them as a convener of conversations, and they have been a huge help in just bringing everybody together to have a discussion on this topic. And this is really only the beginning. You're going to need to go back to your communities and continue these conversations as we all kind of build broadband across the state. Want to introduce you to Stanley Adams. He is the Director of Broadband Initiatives for Kansas. He's been doing this position for about 10 years now. And what he's going to provide us with is basically a lay of the land, a quick review of what are some of the challenges. So Stanley, I'm going to ask you your first question, and you can also tell us a little bit about yourself. How would you describe the challenges Kansas faces with broadband access, and what's important for us to know? Welcome,
thank
Stanley.
you. Yes, good morning. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you. The question is a good one and complicated. So let me try to, at least at the high level, frame up what I think the challenges are. And I can see from the chat box, we've got a wide range of folks, some who I know as much as I do about this subject. So they're going to keep me on my toes, I think. So when I started to think about this and how to describe it, the kind of why we have a challenge, it's really about, we're talking about technology, and it's an evolving technology, right? So one of the reasons that it's been a gradual phasing in of people needing to be on the internet. And that means that there's been gradual changes and upgrades and rebuilds, new builds of network infrastructure to deliver the service. And we're now at the point in the digital economy where the internet access needs to be universal, because it's that universally needed, and just as electricity, and as Deb can talk to about having roads to get to places all across the state. So it's an evolving legacy, is part of the challenge, getting networks upgraded, right? So that's kind of the framework. In general, the way to think about who has broadband and who doesn't, from an infrastructure standpoint, there's a stark difference between who can technically get access to it or not between rural and non-rural communities. In non-rural communities, depending on which data source you look at, it's well into the 90% plus households have access to broadband. In non-rural communities, that number drops. Again, depending on which data you look at, call it 70% for the sake of argument. Order of magnitude is clear in any case. So the challenges are multiple. One of them is obviously, do you have the infrastructure going where it needs to get to all of the households in the state? And the answer to that is no, we do not in some cases. The next thing is what I would call the quality dimension. And this is important and it's easy to overlook. In the numbers, for example, when you say, do you have broadband or not? I think everyone kind of has an idea, yeah, I do, or no, I don't. Well, in our world, actually, the answer is it depends. What do you define as broadband, right? When we're looking at telehealth applications, telemedicine, distance learning, working from home, a funny thing happens. If you all of a sudden, in the light of this pandemic, we have all these folks, a lot of folks are doing a lot more online at home than they used to. So the definition of broadband comes into play. And then There's the affordability dimension, what I like to call constructive access. So you could have the infrastructure, you could have the ability to get service if you have $70, $80, $90 a month, what have you. If you can't afford it, you constructively do not have access. And then lastly, I think the dimension that I would just tee up is just on the digital literacy front, which is a little bit of a sister or brother to the affordability issue. But if you don't recognize the things that you can do on the internet, how to apply for a job, how to take classes online, if you're intimidated by the mouse and clicking with things that we may take for granted, there are folks that are not conversant with the technology. So that's a kind of a high level list of things that kind of shape the umbrella of challenges. And then, I think the plain English is funding is a challenge. And I'll just long-winded answer here, Michelle, but on the funding front, good news at the Department of Commerce, the CARES Act and Spark Task Force just approved us getting $60 million to help mitigate some of these challenges in the face of the pandemic. I can, and in fact, I'm doing a webinar on Friday that you all can kind of hear the whole spiel on that if you like.
Thank you, Stanley. Ed, I'm going to toss it over to you and you can continue further.
Thank you, Michelle. And Stanley, maybe just a quick additional comment. So that's 60 million. I've been reading about that, and we'll be sure to, in fact, in a minute when we start talking with Deb, if you could maybe put in the chat box how people could access that, that would be really fantastic. But I did follow that news that 60 million has been approved to help with that infrastructure, and I understand that there could be more. It's not decided yet, but there could be additional Spark funds available. Spark, for those of you not familiar with that, that's the name for the funds coming from the federal government to help support the pandemic relief and recovery. So there could be even more than that, if I remember correctly. Stanley, is that right?
Yes, that's very much a TBD. What the discussion points that came in deliberating how much funding to provide for broadband infrastructure, as Michelle said, it was all of the working groups came back identifying broadband access as a challenge. So one of the close, as they approved it, I was encouraged because the discussion from the legislators on the panel were around recognition that although $60 million may sound like a lot of money, the truth is when it comes to broadband infrastructure, it's really not.
Yeah.
So there's potential for additional.
We could add another 0 or 2 and maybe still not have enough. Yeah. Stanley, but before I switch over to talk to Deb for a minute, just give us a little sense of your background. You've been at this for a number of years now. You've seen this evolve. 8 years, I think.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And how'd you get into this?
Well, it turns out, way back when, I actually worked for one of the large service providers. It was one of the baby bells that turned into, it actually turned into AT&T Broadband, and then it morphed into Comcast. So I was a marketing director for our national programs for driving people to be on the internet. Yeah. And then at a point in time, I ended up joining the state when if you remember, some of you all may remember, there was a big push to get a better sense of where broadband, this is enough, speaking of challenges, exactly where broadband is and where it isn't. And I joined Commerce when they were first starting to do, each state was starting to take a look at mapping broadband availability so that we could, from a public policy standpoint, start to understand how to deal with the issue. So it's been a slow burn of recognizing the set of issues, and that's kind of gotten us to where we are today.
Well, Stanley, we're glad you're in this role. Thanks for all your service, and we'll get you back into this conversation as we keep going during this hour. So thanks for helping kind of give us a lay of the land. I used to serve in the legislature, and this is one of those issues where I feel like there have been times in the past, 15 years, 20 years where I feel like people feel like we've solved it, but we haven't. And this is an emerging, growing issue, Stanley, as you pointed out. And I want to use that to transition to my friend Deb Miller. Deb, former Secretary of Transportation in the state of Kansas. And it is awesome having you in this conversation with us today. You know, and I know, and a lot of us know that we're never done building out the highway network. We can never fully check that off our list. There's always work to be done. And when we were talking about, when the organizers of this event were talking about this conversation, we were trying to think about how to help it be a different conversation, how to help it not just be kind of another perfunctory, typical conversation about broadband. And we started to think about what's a metaphor we could use to help have the conversation. And one metaphor that came up was utility. And I hear that one a lot. I think that's becoming kind of a standard metaphor. Should broadband be considered a utility? Should it be considered like electricity or water? And that could be. I know that there are a lot of public policy implications for something being deemed a utility or not. So it's a metaphor, but it has some real consequences in what decision is made there. But we thought of a different metaphor, Deb, which is why you're here with us. We started to think about the transportation plans that Kansas has had so much success with. Starting in my understanding is the first plan was about 89 or 90?
1989.
1989. And what a coming together of the state to make an investment. Another big plan then in 1999 and other big plans since, and you've been a part of those. So my first question for you, Secretary Miller, can I still call you Secretary Miller? Is that okay?
Oh, sure, why not?
Okay, all right.
Don't tell Secretary Lorenz you did, but
I won't. But my first question for you, Secretary, is this a good metaphor? Is this a metaphor that's useful in thinking about as we imagine now a different type of infrastructure like broadband? What do you think?
I think it's a really interesting metaphor, and I think it's a good way to think about it because not only are there similarities, but I think the differences are also very informative. So since you contacted me, Ed, I've been thinking about this, and I think one of the differences is just almost the way, it's almost like the origination story, if you will. I mean, transportation is embedded literally in the Kansas Constitution from the beginning, not just in our state, but across the nation. People looked at it as this public good that everyone needed access to, and that there was this governmental interest in being sure it was provided and provided in a way that made it accessible and useful across, the nation, across our state. And one of the things I've been struck by is that as we see the way our economy grows and changes and the way we connect to people, in many ways you could make the argument that broadband is as key and necessary for communities and individuals to be successful as roads are, but you don't have the same structural components or the same governmental commitment that there is a responsibility to see that it's provided, nor sort of that shared sense of, how do we come together, whether it's through public taxes or other purposes, to be sure it's available. So I think you can see where there are similarities. It's infrastructure, it's very expensive. Everyone depends on it. Those are clear similarities. But some of what's been in place for literally 100 years in our country that makes transportation so available to everyone, to me, to my knowledge, though I am not an expert in broadband, but just in fact aren't available. And I think that's why we end up with so many gaps.
Deb, thanks for getting us going. And I failed to mention, I apologize, that Deb is now the director of the KU Public Management Center. So you're in the middle of all kinds of public issues, helping all kinds of people involved in civic life make progress. And I just want to keep this going for a little bit. Again, we're going to be sending people in a bit to some breakout conversations. And I'm going to give a heads up to everybody. The question I'm going to give you when you get sent to the breakout is, what does the exercise of leadership need to look like to advance this issue, to advance broadband. And there are a lot of KLC alums on this call, and you all know that when we say, what does the exercise of leadership need to look like, we don't just mean, what do we need from a governor, or what do we need from Stanley, or what do we need from a cabinet secretary? We mean, what do we need from a whole lot of us, no matter our position in the state, no matter where we're located or what role we play. But Deb, I just want to keep this metaphor going just a little bit, because I mean, it strikes me that look, we're really good in the state of having discussions and debates and wrestling with like how much money to put in to make sure there's highway access to that little tiny town out in Northwest Kansas. And we know that they need to have access to the road network. They need to have that access. And therefore the state feels an obligation, and the people of the state feel an obligation to ensure that. And we're really good at having debates about, well, we might need more money though for a new interchange in Wichita or Johnson County or something like that. And we're good at kind of at debating that and finding ways to get to a plan of massive investment. And my recollection is these highway plans over the years have almost always been wildly popular. And I think that has a lot to do with your leadership, with the leadership of previous secretaries of transportation and previous governors. But can you just talk a little bit about what you learned from the process of cultivating a transportation plan? What you learned about kind of negotiating and engaging and bringing people into the fold for that conversation that led it to be so successful. And I'm just curious what you learned and how that might be applicable for people working on this issue of broadband today.
I think in transportation, we got a lot of things right in Kansas, and I still look back, I feel really proud of that, not because I was the one that got it right, but because over many years I got to be involved in a process, seeing what happens when you have a government program that really hits the right notes. And I think, as you said, Ed, there has always been a commitment and an understanding that every corner of Kansas is touched by and needs to be served by transportation. That doesn't mean, you can build a 4-lane highway every place everybody would want it, but what we can do is we can ensure that there is a connection, that they have a smooth road that is maintained, that we don't allow bridges to become so deteriorated that in essence the road is no good to you. As you always say, if you don't take care of that bridge, the road might as well not even be there. And so the core of the work we've done in Transportation Kansas has always been around the notion that we're not just going to build it, but we're going to maintain it. And that's very important because people get excited about the brand new, shiny, exciting projects, but the real work, what we really need to be focused on is maintaining what we've already constructed. And that's always seemed to be something that people got in Kansas and respected, and we made sure was built into the program. So I think that's important. I think something that over time we've done very well and done very effectively is creating regional conversations around priorities. There is never enough money to do what everyone wants to do, and it's very easy to be angry and frustrated. We told them what our need was. They didn't listen. Yet again, they haven't done it. So we've tried to create structures that could pull communities and people who are active in their community, who care about transportation, into the conversation to say, okay, here are the needs in your region. Here's a reasonable amount of money that might be available. What do we need to do? How do we prioritize it? So really we brought people in to having more of an ownership opportunity in terms of the decision making. And I think that makes a huge difference. So instead of it being about us and them and they didn't listen to us, it's like we're involved in the decision making as well. And I'm really pleased that Secretary Lorenz, who worked at KDOT when I was secretary, helped put together that process that really created regional conversations. So clearly there's a strong commitment to it. And I think, certainly Stanley could answer this. I can't because I haven't been so involved in the broadband conversation, but I think that notion of how do we think about the regional needs and try to prioritize and solve regional needs, to me, is really important. And I can see how that could play out in the broadband decision making. One thing I wanted to say, I've noticed, I can't talk and pay attention and read chat, but I've noticed a few things that have popped up, and somebody brought up 5G. I've been wondering about it too. I think it's interesting, whatever we say about transportation, however different it looks today than it did 100 years ago, you may not realize it, but very much of the roadway system we rely on today was built 100 years ago, and it's still in place. We've modernized it, we've replaced the pavement, we might have widened the road, we might have replaced the bridge, but it's still in place and it is still useful very much, really in its same format. I mean, maybe it was gravel and now it's paved, but it's really the same thing. But one of the questions I've wondered about is, does the same thing apply to broadband? Because that seems to bring some uncertainty into a very expensive proposition. And one of the things I wonder is, does broadband become irrelevant at some point? And how does that then play into the discussion about what we need to do and how we tackle our problems today?
Deb, that's a great question. And Stanley, let me toss that to you here in just a minute. So I want to try to put the question a little bit in a bit of a leadership lens. So, often the leadership is about helping individuals and groups decide what to prioritize. What gets resources. Stanley said earlier, funding. It's always funding. Well, and Stanley, as you know, Secretary Miller, as you know, money just tells us what we value. Right, just tells us what we value. So we've made strong commitments in our state in the past to say we value transportation. We value everybody having access to a road network. And I can imagine that there's some question about, if you're going to value it that much, you want to make sure that infrastructure is going to be needed for a while, going to be around for a while. So Stanley, can you just weigh in on that? Does a metaphor hold up in terms of the infrastructure? Will we keep building on the current infrastructure, or someday will it just be obsolete and we'll be on to something totally different?
I think that's a very interesting and provocative question. I had never thought of the potential for it becoming irrelevant, but it's an interesting question to me, because it's about what is being enabled through the technology in the first place, right? Which also points up that we need to be imaginative. From a leadership perspective, we do need to be imaginative and be focusing on innovation, whether that's the 5G or fiber, what those applications need to look like. It's really, from one of the things that I'm learning and kind of observing right now in the space of the pandemic, where everyone is kind of being more attentive to this issue, is, what are the applications? I think the interesting question is about, what are our future needs going to be? I think the highway analogy is kind of, what are the traffic patterns, and where are you going to need to build a 4-lane instead of expand it from 2 lanes to 4 lanes? You do a lot of work to figure that out, because of the time lag that happens. So I think it holds up in that respect. There's a lot of unknown, and the other piece of it that's just continues to kind of it's just a really difficult issue is, if it's private sector solutions, we're always going to have a divergent set of issues, right? Where the private sector is working, which is where the people are, you're going to have the solution that's going to bubble up, whatever that innovation needs to look like. But on the side where there's not a lot of population, it's going to require some type of vehicle or mechanism to ensure that the service is actually expanded out to those areas.
Stanley,
So Ed,
go ahead, Deb.
Before you dive in, something that Stanley said made me think about an issue that I think is important too when we're using the roadway network, highways, and how we paid for it. So in this situation, we have in Kansas, before anybody talked about, public sector partnerships, 40 years ago, we have built our roadway network and broadly maintained it with private sector companies. So you have this situation where the delivery mechanism is a private sector company, and you use that in a way to get innovations in terms of how they're putting their bid together and thinking about materials. But the decision making in terms of where do we need this road, what should it look like, how are we serving our state, has been made through a government agency who I hope more often than not has been driven by considerations like fairness and equity and, broadly serving the state. And to me, that's something else that it feels like in this discussion where broadband is so important to the success of individuals and communities that is maybe missing. I mean, you know, certainly where you can or where you have grant money, you might have a community or a regional area who's reached out to a private sector company, but much of the system's been built out by private sector companies who've built it where they could build it, cover their costs, and make money. And we have, in transportation, that was not the model that we used. Yeah. And one last thing I would say about that, just to think about models, for people in Kansas who I'm sure for many years like me have driven the Kansas Turnpike, you know, it was built and started right before the interstate system was passed in Kansas. We were very much on the forefront of that as well. But at the time that the Turnpike was built, you know, the ability to build that, it didn't cover its cost in the early days. It did not cover its cost. Now, if you look at what it's done for Kansas, if you do an economic analysis of it, it's had billions of positive impact on Kansas, but it did not cover its cost. And I think the ability to look at an investment and recognize that its benefit is going to stretch out 30 or 40 years, and that, you know, you need to be looking that way when you say, is this an investment we should make? You can't say, is this an investment and 2 years from now it's going to have covered its cost. These kind of things don't pay out in that sort of a time frame.
You know, Deb, what it has me thinking about, and by the way, I love the conversation in the chat box. Keep it going, folks. Engage in this conversation. We're sending you to small groups here in just a little bit to continue the conversation. You know, and I just want to note, you know, the comments about the metaphor. Court, I appreciate what you're saying there in the chat box. What I mean as a metaphor for this is it's a metaphor for thinking about how a state solves an issue. It's certainly not an exact analogous situation. I love to talk in the chat box about rural electrification might be another metaphor. Yeah. Maybe it's a better metaphor. I'm not sure. But from a leadership standpoint, I think what's important to think about is, like, when have we done this before? I don't mean literally built broadband infrastructure, but when have we wrestled with a big public problem and found a way to not just solve it, but in the case of transportation, to become one of the nation's best at transportation infrastructure and plans. And I think that's a unique thing that has been alive and well in the state. Those of you who follow the issues related to transportation, you know that since that first transportation plan, Kansas has had pride as a state government in our network and has marshaled the ability to invest in ways that make other states take notice and say, wow, how do we replicate that? So Deb, my question for you, and I hope I don't make Stanley nervous with this question, but you know, what would trying to solve a problem like highway access across the state, what would that have been like without a cabinet secretary in charge of it? And so Stanley, I might be trying to promote you to cabinet secretary. Yeah. But I just
congratulations, Secretary.
Yeah, and don't worry, I won't tell Secretary Toland. Right. But I think the question I'm really after is, what's the role of authority? What's the role of authority in solving this big, massive challenge for us? Because as you said before, there are other. I mean, there are roles for private companies. There are roles for, but what's the role for authority in this situation, do you think? And just maybe a quick answer, then Stanley, I might ask you to answer that question as well. Yeah. And then we're going to get folks into some small groups.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it is key, and it's authority is important. One, authority. I mean, sometimes just the authority you are vested with by nature of the state statutes allows you to do things that you otherwise couldn't do. I mean, the Secretary of Transportation in Kansas is in fact vested with a pretty broad set of authorities that is recognized and is supported. But I'd say something else, Ed. It's not just authority, it is responsibility. I mean, you know who to look at when things are failing. A legislative committee knows who to call over and say, what is going on and why is this failing our communities? But when broadband isn't working, you know, who do you point the finger at? Who do you call? I mean, who goes to bed at night worried that they're not living up to what they pledged to do, because it's, to me at least, it looks like it's just so diverse and diffused in terms of who has responsibility. And then the question you started with, authority, and who has the authority and how far does your authority go? In Kansas, states are different, many are quite similar, but in Kansas, Secretary of Transportation has very clear authority, very clear responsibility, and is given very clear authorities to carry out that responsibility. I'm not sure we have a mechanism that looks like that when we start thinking about broadband.
You know, Stanley, you talked about that we've had this gradual increase in usage. And so like one of the, I think, leadership questions or problem solving questions here that is related to any big emerging topic.
Poor connectivity there.
Oh, can you hear me now, Stanley?
Go ahead.
Okay. All right. One of the questions I think, Stanley, on any kind of issue that is emerging is, when is it a big enough issue that you need more centralized authority helping provide direction? And when can you continue to rely on a diffuse system? So do you have a quick reaction to that before we go to small groups?
I do. I think that encapsulates part of the real challenge here, right? When I was trying to think about these metaphors, I was reading some of the chat discussion, and I do think which metaphor is the right one is a very interesting one. And it seems like one of the things that's different is, at what point in time do you have consensus of the need, right?
Yeah.
You know, I don't know my history to know when the consensus developed that everybody needs electricity, or everyone needs telephone. I know those things happened though, right?
Yeah.
Where it was a decision from a public policy standpoint that had to happen. So I do think broadband is similar in that regard. It goes to this argument, and I'm dancing on a trouble line here, so I'm going to get off of this one real quick, but it goes to this question of, is it a utility? Is there a public interest, right? In order to support justification for the authority to be vested someplace, versus the private market. Again, that's kind of what I talked about at the top. The evolution has been private market solutions. The technologies have evolved, right? I mean, we went from telephone lines being able to deliver internet service. If anybody remembers the AOL disk and the 28 baud modems. I mean, it's been a long evolution, but it's been a dramatic one. So I don't know from a practical standpoint, how do you declare? I think it is a leadership question. I think we're starting to see signs of that at the federal level. They are saying, the FCC, affirmatively says everyone needs access to internet. So now, to me, the question, Ed, is, what does that look like? What's the next iteration of authority? Because it's been decided that everyone needs broadband from a federal authority standpoint, and therefore they put money behind it. But still, we aren't at a point where there's, at the state level, and this is not unique to Kansas, we typically do not have the authority focus on and defining what that needs to look like, whether it's now or in 10 years from now.
And it's emerging so fast. It might be one of those situations where we have to adapt faster in how we govern ourselves than we have on previous issues that might be similar to this. Let's go to some small groups. Thane, I think you're going to take us away in just a minute. A couple of thoughts before we do so. Here's the question, and if Thane or Julian, if one of my team members could put this in the chat box for me. The question is, what does the exercise of leadership need to look like on this issue? What does the exercise of leadership need to look like on this issue? Again, I would ask you to think about, what does it need to look like for you? What does it need to look like for others? But don't just think about others. What does the exercise of leadership need to look like for you, for your organization, for your agency, for your company? And what does it need to look like for others? We'll be in small groups for, let's go 8 minutes. Thane, you're all gonna be shoved into a small group with people you don't know. Please just become friends real fast and start exploring the question. And when you come back, we'd love to hear some thoughts and answer some questions. Looks like folks are coming back. Hope you had a good conversation. So would love to explore, would love you to get your fingertips fired up, and would love for you to share how you answered this question or how you heard others answer this question. And by the way, we're recording this and we'll also have a transcription of the chat. So the more thoughts and ideas we can get in the chat box right now about this question, frankly, the better. So if you could, loosen up your fingers, just to let you know my standard rule of small group work. If you don't feel comfortable sharing how you answered the question, just share how somebody else answered the question in your group. They won't care, right? Just say Andy Huckabee said, or something like that, and it'll be just fine. But please, fire up that chat box. Let's see if anything is coming in. Again, the question is, what does the exercise of leadership need to look like on this? And I'd love to have some people chime in there. That's one of the things we wanted to be a little different about this conversation. We know that broadband is an incredibly technical issue. There's a lot of complexity to it and a lot of very difficult technical aspects to it. What we thought that the Topeka Chamber and the Kansas Leadership Center could offer in this conversation is not to be another place where we explore all those, but to be a place that begins to kind of scratch the surface of what does leadership look like to advance this. So thank you everybody for diving in. And let's see what's in the chat box here. Tara May said, we discussed the need to prioritize regionally the way that the highway programs did public input process. There's a lot of needs within a region, and this is an important way to build a consensus to hold local officials accountable. Stanley, maybe a quick reaction or thought about what does that look like right now? And that's such a moving target, right? It's such a moving target. But is there an effort to listen regionally? Is it statewide now? Is it diffuse? Or any thoughts you have about Tara's comment there about the need to prioritize regional listening or engagement around this type of topic?
Well, that's an interesting point. So it kind of comes back to the evolution point I made earlier. This as an issue, this subject as an issue is starting to ripen to the point where it becomes clearer that there is a need for doing some regional engagement. The Lieutenant Governor does a listening tour by region to try to hear from folks what their issues are, and broadband comes up. So we do not have currently a formalized approach to kind of help facilitate that. But I do think, in fact, I probably should have said this earlier, in terms of an action item and from a leadership perspective you can do is to, at the local or regional level, to form your own kind of working committee or group to identify and kind of quantify your priorities, what your issues are, and which ones are more important. And then as opportunities come up, for example, this funding opportunity that I'm overseeing with the grants, your community would then be in a position to say, yes, we want to put an application in for that. Because sure enough, everything's always going to be a hurry up when the funding is finally available. So that's a couple of pieces to it.
Love that, Stanley. And again, folks, keep putting your thoughts in the chat box there. What does the exercise of leadership need to look like? I got a lot of pride for our state. I think a lot of you on this call do too. We don't want Kansas to just be kind of getting by on this. I'd love Kansas to be at the head of the pack on this. I would love this to be the place where we solve this question. Like in some ways we have solved other big public questions in the past. So it's going to take a lot of leadership though. So keep exploring in the chat box there what it looks like. Just want to mention a couple things that I'm seeing in the chat box, and would love some more reactions from our crew here. Jeff Usher talked about bringing other stakeholders to the conversation, those who can't afford Wi-Fi, those who don't have access because of their location. Deb, what that made me think about is, like on the transportation metaphor, there's the infrastructure, but then there's the affordability question of things like public transit, or who can afford a car. How do we make sure people are able to utilize the infrastructure, which is a related and yet different question from how do we create the infrastructure. So Any reflections, Deb, on kind of the crossover between talking about the creation of infrastructure and then talking about how do we make sure there's equitable access?
Yeah, totally. No, I was thinking about that a little bit earlier today, Ed, because you're exactly right. I mean, on the one hand, we have this publicly owned, share the cost infrastructure, but in order to access it, primarily outside of a few very large cities, you have to have your own vehicle in order to have access.
Yeah.
And I would argue from where I sit that even though you pay taxes to support roadways, it's very, very small. It's very affordable. Everybody has access. But the truth of the matter, car ownership is in fact expensive, right? And, you know, if you don't have that vehicle, you don't have access to that public good. And I think that's another example where the analogy between broadband and transportation holds up.
Yeah, it gets into the public transportation debates and things like that. And you know, the complexity of this, but I mean, some kids don't have laptops. They don't have hotspots.
Right.
They don't have, and now more than ever, we're realizing how that's putting some families, some Kansans at a disadvantage. Sherry says, someone needs to take the lead on pulling all stakeholders together to come up with a needs assessment plan on what to deploy, where and how. So Sherry, to put that in some of the, you know, the KLC kind of framework, the way we would put that is, you know, that's one of the roles of authority, is to provide the direction of how should the stakeholders engage and what should the result of that engagement be. And so, yeah, and I think the leadership question is, when is an issue big enough where it requires someone to take that lead Sherry is talking about, and when is it not at that point yet? And I think what we're really exploring during this hour is, maybe we're there. Maybe, you know, 10 years ago, maybe we weren't there. 15 years ago, maybe we weren't there. Maybe we're there now. And perhaps the state that figures that out first or soonest will end up being one of the states that really takes the lead, and imagine the benefit for the economy, for the health and wellness of the people.
You know, Ed, to expand that to expand that further, I think what's important, or what's interesting in the chat, is just the fact that people use it in different ways. But what I'm seeing in the chat is we're all in agreement that there needs to be a collective pride. So what is that pride that kind of holds us together, while at the same time people are using it with an interest of digital equity or education or telehealth, or just having it, you know, in our rural areas.
Yeah, I love that, Michelle. And connected to kind of pride is like, how do we talk about it? You know, Stephanie says, moving the messaging to a right, not a luxury. And a lot of us on this Zoom know that how we frame something matters. How we frame something matters. And you know, the utility frame might be a perfect frame. There could be downsides of that frame too. The frame of a right versus a luxury. You know, Stephanie's introducing a different type of, you know, metaphor or frame, but finding the right frame is going to be very, very important. And I can imagine years and years ago, and other big public problems, they had to think about, how do we talk about this to help people engage around it. Lots of other things in the chat box. I have 71 new messages that I haven't seen yet. So you all are doing an incredible job of exploring this. Our assumption is, on big public problems, solutions come by the many exercising leadership, not the few. We need key authorities in the state to do their part, but their part can never be sufficient on these deep, daunting, what we would call adaptive challenges. So by being on this call, you're helping do your part. Our hope, again, just want to be clear, our hope is that we were catalyzing conversation. We could spend a whole week talking about this and not cover all the topics. Our hope was to catalyze conversation, and we hope you carry this conversation in your head and in your words as you go forth. So I want to let Michelle and Sean each say one quick thing before we sign off. So Michelle, on behalf of the Topeka Chamber, how do you want to close out here?
On behalf of the Greater Topeka Partnership, thank you all for coming to the table and having a discussion. Again, this was the Catalyst approach. Please go back to your communities, continue to have this conversation, and let's find ways to work together to advance Kansas.
Thanks, Michelle. And many of you know our Director of Civic Engagement, Sean Rojas, who's been with KLC from almost the beginning. Sean, you're in touch with all types of civic engagement efforts across the state. Final words from you about this conversation and about things up ahead.
Yes, thanks everyone for participating. Thanks for being here. Two things. One, we will have a recording of this on our website that week sometime, and we will do our best to find a way. I'm getting a lot of requests about saving the chat and the information in there, so we'll do our best to get this chat and post that as well, because there's some really good ideas and comments there. And lastly, I posted the website to our quarterly magazine that we're really proud of at the Kansas Leadership Center, where we talk about issues and we help give people a leadership lens to those issues. So if you haven't checked it out, please do so. And if you have any questions or any thoughts, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to chat with you. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Take care. Give me a big round of applause for Stanley and Deb, please. You know, rowdy round of applause. Nice. I miss hearing rounds of applause, but thank you for your great work, Stanley and Deb. We appreciate it. Take care, everyone.